Just a little bit over 50 years ago, a very enigmatic Mongolian monk named Geshe Wengyal sailed into the harbor in New York aboarding the SS Liberté to settle in the United States. I decided to start this morning talking about Wengyal because he turned out to be the living human bridge in a changing political movement to maintain Tibet's freedom that began as a Cold War operation in the 1950s under President Truman and continued to become a counterculture cause up till today, where it's a mass global movement. And that transformation of a political movement to maintain freedom for an occupied country is really a kind of profound thing. Geshe literally means doctor of divinity. Wengyal was a Kalmyk Mongol. The Kalmyks were people who lived in Mongolia, but who shared Tibetan Buddhism going back several hundred years. They shared beliefs in Tibetan Buddhism with the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan theocracy. He never would have come to the United States if it weren't for World War II. At the end of World War II, there were many displaced people in the Soviet Union, including in Mongolia, and a group of Kalmyks, about 600, decided that they would apply to settle in the United States and ended up in New Jersey. The problem was they had no religious leader at all in New Jersey. There were no Buddhists in the United States worth speaking about, a handful on the West Coast, but otherwise Buddhism was about as exotic as it could be. When Geshe sailed into, I'm going to call him Geshe, which sort of means doctor. Geshe Law is the way his students referred to him, which was a fond way of saying doctor. But when Geshe sailed into the harbor in New York, he was such a colorful figure that the news services sent out a photographer to take a full portrait of him and put it in the newspapers. I mean, this was a big development. This Buddhist priest arrives in the United States. Geshe attracted attention from a lot of different quarters. He was the first individual to introduce American diplomats to the Dalai Lama's family. At the request of the Dalai Lama's mother, he went down to Calcutta, contacted the American consulate in the early 1950s, and pleaded with the consulate to send a diplomat up to meet with the Dalai Lama to discuss how he might receive exile in the United States and flee Chinese persecution in Tibet. Geshe also attracted interest from America's beatniks in the 1950s. Coincidentally with the interest of American diplomats in the Central Intelligence Agency, people like Jack Kerouac, who was then an absolutely unknown writer, were developing an interest in Buddhism generally, first in Zen Buddhism, and later specifically through the work of Allen Ginsberg and Robert Campbell in Tibetan Buddhism. The mid-1950s were the beginning of a period of cultural ferment in the United States with the beatnik movement that would eventually become the support basis for the Tibetan resistance, but eventually took about 20 years because something else was happening in 1955 when Geshe Wengyal sailed into New York Harbor. Here in Washington, D.C., President Eisenhower was trying to figure out how best to fight against international communism. In a series of National Security Council meetings throughout 1955, he'd been presented with options ranging from open warfare to covert subversion of Russian and Chinese communist activity around the world. It was only recently learned that in the early 1950s, the U.S. intelligence services had picked up definitive information that Russia and China were cooperating in the Korean War. When this information was presented to Eisenhower, he decided that the U.S. had to have a response to international communism. And what that meant roughly was the U.S. believed that Russia and China were cooperating so closely in opposing American interests around the world that we, in turn, had to fight against both of them as if they were one. This was the theory of monolithic communism, and in 1955 it looked true. Right around Christmas of that year, Eisenhower signed a document for the National Security Council called 5412-2. 5412-2 was a document outlining activities that the Central Intelligence Agency should undertake worldwide to undermine international communism. And it was an extremely specific document. It's kind of fun to read it. We put it in the appendix of the book. But it directs, it doesn't ask, it directs the CIA to go out and begin guerrilla wars wherever feasible against communism around the world, to carry out sabotage, to discredit the prestige and reputation of communism, and to do all other activities compatible with that order short of actually starting a war. And furthermore, to do it secretly, and to do it in such a way that the U.S. could deny that it had ever happened. 5412-2-1, which we don't go into much, was a National Security Council document basically saying that the CIA would be responsible for all covert activity in the government, not the Defense Department, not the State Department, not the Office of Personnel Management, not the FBI. 5412-2, once Eisenhower signed it, set in motion a vast change for the Tibetans. The Tibetans had lived with Chinese occupation since 1950. Shortly after Chairman Mao managed to get the nationalists off the mainland, he turned his eyes on Tibet and sent the army in there. The Tibetans weren't sure how to respond to this. So in 1955, while Eisenhower was signing 5412-2 and Geshe Wangyal was landing in New Jersey to become the spiritual leader for a community of Kalmyk Mongols, the Dalai Lama was in Beijing meeting with Chairman Mao. The Dalai Lama attempted for a long period to establish a modus vivendi with China. He really wanted to figure out how can we cooperate in a way that will allow the Tibetans to keep their culture and their religion alive and their traditional system of government somewhat alive, but still within the context of Chinese occupation, Chinese rule. This is a period of great dissension within the Tibetan world. In eastern Tibet, in provinces like Kham and Amdo, there was a lot of resistance to the Chinese. And in areas where the Chinese began to try to implement reforms aggressively, particularly communal reforms that involve seizing people's land, livestock, the Tibetans often spontaneously rose up in resistance. This happened also in other regions, but Kham, I think, probably was the center of the resistance. And 1955 was a year when the resistance fighting really flared in Kham. Several major Chinese garrisons were besieged, and it was a spontaneous kind of revolt that was perfect for the purposes of 5412-2. Geshe's contacts with American diplomats in Calcutta were the basis for the CIA to be able to make contact with leading Tibetan figures in the Dalai Lama's immediate circle, particularly his one of his older brothers, Gyalo Tondop, and also Norbu, another older brother, Norbu Jigme, for the purpose of offering American support. And that support was quite specific. The U.S. would train Tibetan guerrillas to fight the Chinese, and the U.S. would support the Tibetan government, provided the Dalai Lama came into exile. Getting him to actually leave Tibet was a huge adventure story that is very much like something out of an Indiana Jones tale, probably. Lots of swashbucklers involved there. It took him about 18 days to make the passage from Lhasa to India. And during that time, President Eisenhower received radio reports from his CIA director every other day, charting the progress of the Tibetans. The CIA had managed to train and put in place some agents who could accompany the Dalai Lama and his retinue on a very hazardous journey through the mountains. And Eisenhower was in almost real time getting information about what was happening, thanks to Geshe. Geshe was brought down to Washington to a safe house in Georgetown to translate the radio reports coming out of Tibet about the Dalai Lama and his movements. Once he was safely out, a full-fledged guerrilla operation began. I think that the Tibetan National Uprising of 1959, in which ultimately some 85,000 Tibetans lost their lives, was probably the high watermark of that resistance. Many of the weapons that had been flown into Tibet and parachuted down into the Himalayas came directly as a result of the American support operation. The Dalai Lama himself never personally sanctioned this violence. In fact, he was very dubious, and for a long time the United States, as the declassified diplomatic cables show, was equally dubious about him. I mean, there was great fear that the Dalai Lama might cooperate with Beijing, particularly in the period when he was meeting with Chairman Mao, and undermine the idea of a resistance operation on the top of the world. I first became interested in this personally in South Africa in the early 1990s when one of the CIA officers who was intimately involved with the operation in India told me about it.